Hello and welcome to What's Not Gas. Today, this is a Longtail. I'll be talking about the Longtail bike, what it means and what you need to look out for when you're buying one or comparing one online or in the store. Okay, so what is a Longtail bike? Basically, a cargo bike is what everyone's talking about, but cargo bikes can be a lot of things. You have front loaders, you have rear loaders, and this is the Longtail bike. Long tail, that's basically all you have to think about. It's the tail that's a bit longer. That's it. It's called a cargo bike and they fall into the same category as those box bikes, but it's clearly not the same. So from now on, let's call these long tail bikes and call box bikes or cargo bikes. So first things first, we usually look at the design first, and that means the frame as well as the wheel size. The wheel size is quite important. A lot of people talk about that, so we'll get into that right after. Here you can see this is a recent Müller multi-charger from 2019, before Longtail was popular, and you can see they used a mountain bike version, the charger, and they made it a bit longer. Nowadays we really see brands that make designs purely to fit the Longtail bike description, but for some niches there are alternative models available. The frame is two things. It's the material that's being used and the design, the way it looks. You can have a low step that's meant for men and women who share the same bike and who need that low step to get on easily. The second thing was the material. So usually you have a choice between steel and aluminum. Aluminum or aluminium, I don't know, depends on you. Usually they're made in aluminum. I'm gonna stick to aluminum. Because it has some advantages, the biggest advantages being in production, it's easier and it's cheaper. They can keep the cost of the bike lower because they choose aluminum. They just have to strengthen it a bit in some specific areas to make sure it fits the necessities of the cargo bike. Aluminum also absorbs the shocks a bit more compared to steel and has no corrosion, so it doesn't rust as fast. On the downside, it's a lot less strong and less durable than steel. Steel, on the other hand, is more durable and stronger, obviously. It also provides some type of extra riding comfort. It just doesn't flex as much as aluminum does. And so, yeah, it has its benefits, but it's more costly and it's heavier as well. One like this is aluminum, but also because it needs to be a bit lighter because it's meant to be a sportive longtail bike. So let's just say it depends on what you're looking for, the budget and the model or the design that you want. Okay, so then we go over to the tires, because this is a longtail bike which has normal tires, 27-inch. It's a mountain bike that's also a longtail, but usually we don't see these sizes being used. 26-inch is commonly used, but that's one of the bigger wheel sizes, and then we move down to 24, 20. I haven't seen anything smaller than 20, so let's say that's the bare minimum, and that's also what's very popular these days. The 20-inch ones, the ones that are mainly used in the city, and the benefit of those smaller wheels is that the center of gravity of your bike, with that much cargo, it's very important, is kept very low. As you can see here with the 27-inch, it's quite up high, and if you have two kids here, the bike tends to lean. Also, when you're cornering and your kid just does a swing one way, then you have more tendencies to fall. While if you have the smaller rims and you're lower to the ground, that has much less effect. There's also something to say about the brands that use different size wheels. They use a bigger wheel in the front and a smaller wheel in the back. Now, this can be a handy option because it does work on that center of gravity, and at the same time you keep that front wheel luxury. Now, the higher up the bike is, the more chance there is also of, if you put too much weight on the back, that the bike flips. And that's also something you need to watch out for on any given type of model. As soon as the wheels, especially the front wheel, becomes bigger, there's more chance of that flip happening. Now, needless to say, even with this on steep hills, it's never happened, but it's definitely something to keep in mind, especially if you think you're not capable of holding the bike down. Another thing to keep in mind is who you're buying this bike for. Is it mom? Is it dad? Is it both? Is it even more users? It all depends, and everyone needs to be as comfortable as they can because they're gonna move this cargo around, right? So depending on the amount of users, you want to have that low step, you want to have an adapted design, but you also want a seat post and a steering wheel that's adaptable, so you can bring it closer, further, higher, lower, whatever it takes to keep that perfect straight up ergonomic position to make sure you're comfortable and that you can carry this cargo without even needing to consider your own safety or comfort. And if we say comfort, People instantly think about the front suspension. And in most scenarios, that's kind of right, because so far, except for last week when we saw one at Ebike, but so far there's very little Longtail bikes with frame suspension. Suspension in the frame is not really necessary because, well, it depends on your cargo, I guess, and if it's two kids, they do want a not that bumpy ride. But you have children's seats with springs in them. To avoid that, you don't really need a suspension in the frame. That's why everyone looks at the front fork, and you also need to look at the quality and the adjustability of the front fork. It's quite important. But many people overestimate the need for a suspension. If you're driving flat roads, it's really not necessary. If you do have bumpy roads, or you drive around in the city where you go up and down the curb quite often, or cobblestone roads, whatever, then you might need that front fork. Might, because the choice of material in frame again plays a role. Now, the front fork covers anything that hits your hands and your shoulders, but if you're worried about your lower back, you need one of these. A seat suspension is probably one of the best methods, or the cheapest compared to suspension in the frame, to have some extra comfort for your lower back. As far as gears go, there's still a lot of discussion, and to be honest, I'm not quite sure as to where this is going or where we're at when you're watching this video. I just got back from Ebike 2024, and it's one of the leading bike fairs. One of the biggest changes there is these gears and engines. Engines and gears, they're gonna become one. But these are innovations. They're not there yet, and as you can see here, in 2019, it was still a derailleur with a metal chain. So what's changed? What are the options? Starting with this first, this is the old school derailleur metal chain. What's important here is that quality. If you have top quality performing pieces here, there's not really a need for anything else. Keep in mind that it always will ask some maintenance. Also important is on electric bikes, these chains need to be extra strong because those Newton meters, that torque that pulls on them, a normal chain wouldn't hold. So quality is key when you go for an older system. Second in line is the internal gears. And it's a piece in the rear wheel that shifts the gears. The gears are internal and have a benefit of not having any external pieces, so no dirt can come into them, they don't need as much maintenance, or they don't need any maintenance. You can shift while standing still, which is also a big positive, and they barely make any noise, or they shouldn't at least. Those come equipped with a metal chain, but can also be equipped with a carbon gates belt, which we've seen very often and is very commonly used. The whole benefit of that system is you require no maintenance and everything becomes, let's say, more automatic. Although you still need to manually shift on those systems, everything happens internally. An upgrade from that internal system is the automatic shifting that we see, for example, now on the Enviolo Automatic or on different driving systems that are coming out. There you don't need to shift anymore, everything just happens while you're cycling, which can be handy, but can also make the ride quite boring and sometimes give you that feeling that it's just not in the right setting, or at least not the one that you prefer. The last version, and that's where we go to Ebike again, or to Pinion, who had the MGU, they have the gears and the motor integrated into one piece. This is quite innovative and has a lot of pros, actually has the most pros of all systems, but is quite a new system and still needs to be developed a bit more. Alright. Turns out I forgot to record the part about the engines. First off is the placement of the engine, because that makes the biggest difference. It's either placed in the rear wheel or in the middle of the bike, mid-hub engines. Let's be honest, mid-hub engines are better, they're stronger, and they give more capacity and ability to carry cargo. Rear wheel hubs are cheaper and sometimes do have that same power, but the placement of that engine makes a difference. The rear wheel needs to push all that weight whilst most of the cargo is sitting on that rear wheel, whilst the mid-engine pulls that weight forward. And that means, especially going uphill, you have a benefit with the mid-hub or the mid-engine. They also make a difference when considering gears. On a rear wheel motor, you have that direct support, and so the gears don't matter that much. But if you have a mid-engine, you can really use that leverage that the gears offer to get more out of the Newton meters coming out of your mid-hub engine. That said, second most important is power. In Europe, they're all limited to 250 watts. And so for that reason, we look at Newton meters rather than total output or wattage, which is capped at 250 watts. For mid-hub engines, we see powerful engines from Shimano and Bosch, or even Bafang, that have Newton meters of, let's call it 75 to 120, with 85 being an absolute benchmark for me. I have 85 in my Bosch CX on a multi-charger, and it gives me the capabilities of going up any hill with any weight. Of course, within the limitations of the bike. If you have less Newton meters, it's going to be difficult on a steep hill. You'll need to push the bike yourself a bit more, but on a flat surface, even 75 or 65 is more than enough. If we look at the rear wheel, you have to look at it different. There 60 is quite a bit and 40 is a benchmark. Again, for longtails where you have a lot of cargo, you want more than 40, maybe aiming for that 60 at least, especially if you're planning on carrying quite a heavy weight. Last part about the engine is how it's integrated into the bike. The engine also has an influence on the price and how you use the bike. It also has an influence on where you can have the bike repaired. Most bike shops will have no issue repairing a Bosch, a Shimano or even Bafang, but might have some trouble when you arrive with an unknown brand. Also, that can be quite important on the Longtail bike. We see brands that have one engine and it's integrated into their design, but we see some other brands like Bike43, Veloe, even Doos Cycling, there's quite a few, that are starting to make a modular Longtail bike, meaning the frame stays the same and the engine is modular, meaning the frame stays the same, but you can fit different types of engines onto that frame. It increases the longevity or the durability of the bike. If there's ever an issue with the engine, you can just take it out and place a new one, no issues. So that should kind of cover all questions you could have about the engines on Longtail bikes. Of course, there's a lot of changes coming, so there will be quite a few updates necessary here, but time for another video once all of that technology is out. For now, what I can tell you is it's clear the market picked Shimano EP6 or EP8 as well as the Bosch cargo lines or the CX. They're all very powerful and very capable of confronting any terrain with any type of cargo. Okay, and then this part, which is actually probably the most important part, but then again you're buying an electric bike, so the bike is also quite important. The length of this Longtail starts playing a role. If you're moving one kid, this is perfect. You have one kid plus their cargo. As you can see, I'm using it for one kid, sitting quite close to me, so I have a little more room for some extra. If you use this for two children, which is meant for, it can fit one and a second, it becomes very tight. For small kids, no worries, but if your kids get bigger within the child seat, that becomes a little difficult because their legs are big and your feet, whilst turning, it might hit the pedal, so you need to watch out for that. Some brands like Bike43 or Veloe or Yuba, for example, have longer longtails. Extra long, fit for 3 kids if it's just sitting on there, or 2 kids plus a bit of extra space and cargo. I specifically like Bike43 because they built their bike with that in mind. They have this little cargo bin here where your feet of the front kid go in, and so you don't have that issue whatsoever. It's really something you need to think about, and a lot of brands made that error before realizing that it could be problematic. Now they're bringing out a second version, and you notice that they give it a bit more space. Which brings you to the last point, and that's the total size of your Longtail bike, because also that has an influence on which one you pick. Next to the size of the rims, the size of the wheels, the tires are also quite important. You know, tires can be thick, they can be thin, they can be slick, and they can be rough. Everything has an influence on how you drive and the comfort you have whilst driving. So not the comfort necessarily, but more the grip, which is quite important. As I mentioned, I ride these big 27-inch wheels, and as you can see, they're also quite thick, and they have a mountain bike style structure. This was a choice that I made because out here we have a lot of rough terrain, and one of the reasons why I chose for a Longtail over a car is you can take a lot of shortcuts if you cut through the fields. This is a mountain bike, and I can really treat it that way. I can go on courses and tracks where 20-inch Longtails wouldn't be able to follow at all. That said, there are locations and routes where those 20-inchers are way better than this. It's also a personal choice, you know? Do you like it? Don't you like it? Do you want small wheels? Don't you want small wheels? There's pros and cons in both, but there's not necessarily one that's better than the other. It all depends. So, I've covered quite a few points already. One that's also important to you, but quite personal, is the size. Now, the size, the Longtail is always a bit longer than a normal bike, you would imagine, but they're actually trying to make Longtails that are the same size as a normal e-bike. The reason is quite simple. It's so that you can take it on a holiday and so that it fits on those bike racks on the car. Another reason is you need to put it somewhere, and most of the infrastructure is meant for normal sized bikes, so a Longtail wouldn't fit. If you count on using this for older kids as well, think about the carry capacity as well as the length of the rack. And so there we touch upon a different point. Size is one thing, the carry capacity is another important point. It means the total capacity the bike can hold. This means the frame, the structure, but also those rims. But so that carry capacity is quite an important feature. Usually they can hold up to 200, 220 kilos. Some models hold up to 180 kilos. Those 180 kilos include the bike weight, so that's also something to keep in mind, as well as your weight and the cargo. The last thing that's kind of related to you as a person is the way you want to sit. Do you want to sit upright and have this normal, comfortable position, or do you want to sit a bit more sportive, like this bike, for example, where you're leaning forward and thus you're putting more weight on the front? There you might need that front suspension. It's also a bike that I take off-roading, so it's normal that you have those features. I'm down here to explain to you that utility is one of the biggest features of this Longtail bike. It needs to be a good bike, but it also needs to be useful, and needs to make sure that you as a parent or as someone carrying cargo don't have any issues whatsoever. And one of the biggest elements that plays a role in that feature is the standard, the foot, whatever you want to call it, the bike stand. It's 2024, this is a model from 2019, and in those 5 years, every Longtail bike brand has learned that this just doesn't work. I don't need to cover it because nobody makes this anymore, but you need a double stand, one that keeps the bike straight and preferably one that holds the bike whilst the cargo is being lifted onto the bike. That's quite important. Equally important is that once the cargo is on the bike, you need to be able to start and go, but first you need to be able to swing your leg over without hitting the cargo. That means the step through this needs to be a bit lower if you have, for example, 2 kids in the back that you don't want to karate kick. But so utility plays one of the biggest roles on a Longtail bike, and brands are starting to realize that that's where they can make the biggest difference. It's also possibly the place where they can get the highest margins on products, accessories. If it rains, I just drive in the rain. However, if that is an issue in your case, there's these new type of tents that you basically put over the monkey bars or the safety bars, whatever you want to call them, and they provide a shelter for your kids. At first, these designs were a bit rough and very non-aerodynamic. Now we see the newer versions are aerodynamic, stronger, they have more breathing capabilities, let's say, to also be used as sun covers, and they're starting to be made from this reflective material, so it increases visibility in the evening or in the morning. What we also see is that those monkey bars, which used to be very standard and universal at first, are now changing and being adapted to accommodate the parents lifting the kids on or off the bike. Bike 43, for example, one of the first had this telescopic, let's say, monkey bars that you could just lift up and the kids could mount off and on. What's quite impressive on that one is that you can change the length of the monkey bars based on the length of the Longtail that you're using. On the Bike 43, you have the capability of changing the underboard and so making it longer or shorter, while using the same frame of the bike. But we see that others are following. Ries and Müller, for example, on Eurobike 2024 showed off their new cabins and how it's going to look for them, and we can say it's quite impressive. Velobike, for example, they were the ones at Eurobike that showed off that reflective feature, and it really made me wonder why no other brands had thought of that before. Other accessories are, for example, the safety pads on the side so that your kids' feet can get into the wheels, as well as the loading boards that are on the side so they can stand on it while you're riding. And usually you can take those planks away to fit the front wheel of a kid's bike and to carry those with you as well. I almost forgot. Brakes, quite important on a cargo bike, which this is. A Longtail bike still is a cargo bike. Because you carry cargo and thus more weight on this bike, it's quite important that you think about your stopping distance. You need to be able to brake even when that load is pushing down on the front fork or even on the rear wheel. Downhill, for example, when you're at a fast speed and you need to make an emergency stop, it's quite important that you're able to do so. And so we look at the quality of the brakes, the dimension of the disc, as well as the pistons in the caliper. For cargo bikes, it's usually advised to have 4 pistons in the caliper, just like you would for an electric mountain bike. Okay, so I think I've covered everything. Really didn't want to make this video any longer. If you have any questions, just put them in the comments. It gives us a reason to interact. And if you like the video, like and a thumbs up and a subscribe so that you stay up to date on everything I do and cover. Hope you enjoyed the video, regardless of your liking. And I will see you now. Damn, I always get this wrong. You will see me in the next video. Ciao.